This presentation is called Bridging the Gap, 3 student-led strategies to connect coursework from the minor in design thinking into a student-specific field of study. I'm Adam Fromme, Assistant Professor of Teaching at Ohio State.
And I'm Zach Winegardner. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Design at Ohio State. Our presentation today will focus on a problem surrounding the gap between major and minor coursework and how we came to understand and define that problem, as well as a strategy for solving that derives from supporting theory and then some outcomes assessment and how educators would be able to implement their own solutions.
As we begin to reflect on our minor, one of the things that we realized is that within the university setting, there is not a lot of intentionally designed carryover between students that are in their major program and then those that take a minor course study as well. And this flies in the face of a lot of things that we're trying to work towards in university: collaboration, community engagement, idea sharing. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of see what is out there and how we can improve the minor course that we both teach within. As we look at some of the current strategies that are out there, we identified 2 primary ones. In scenario 1, you see a student that is maybe a business major and taking a minor in, say, Spanish. In this setup, those 2 programs run completely independent of one another. There's no real integration between those 2 tracks. In scenario 2, we have that same business major, but maybe doing a minor in finance. In this setup, there is some integration, there's some crossover between the 2. But what we found is that in that minor, it is in service of the major because that minor fits underneath the same domain that the major is in. And so we saw this as an opportunity to reimagine what this could look like, focusing on these ideas of collaboration and integration between the 2 programs. And so the scenario that we saw is a way for both programs to have carryover between the 2, where there's a stronger connection between the courses in the major and the minor, which would give students give the students more opportunity to think, process, and construct meaning that are driven by the assignments that are focused on student interest. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, is how we imagined this scenario and what some of the advantages are to the strategies that we were using, focusing on the student's focus, perspective, application, and the outcomes associated with that.
So just for some context, we started to realize this problem through the courses that Adam and I teach that are part of the Department of Design's offering of the minor in design thinking. And there are 3 primary courses that we redesigned some of the assignments in, and those are essentially the design process, visualization, and the presentation. And these are presented to students as a way to introduce them to problem solving in the lens of design thinking. And this is where our kind of case study was to see how could we improve these classes so that that major and minor become more integrated with each other.
So the aim for this, our orientation point of our redesign, was to focus on the student experience. And so to do that, we really focused on what are the learning principles, not so much the teaching principles. We saw that those could follow later. Instead, we focus on these learning principles, being able to focus on that student experience in the classroom and what the opportunity is for their coursework to intersect each other. So that way they can start to have the sense of motivation and folding in of their own ideas. And so looking at how these perspectives and the applications of these principles could fold together, what we identified were that there's sort of these 3 core values that could be sort of synthesized from those principles. That student work needs to be meaningful, the students need to be able to assert some influence, not just in the classroom, but specifically within the assignments, and that the student assessments is process oriented rather than results driven. All of those things really sort of pointed us into this direction of student-led assignment. So that became our orientation point as we move forward in this process.
So in these student-led assignments, we began to develop some strategies of how can we implement those principles. And the first strategy we came up with is flexible prompts. And this is most evident in the visualization class 3305. And we'll look at examples from 2 one-week projects, but it really is implemented in nearly all of the assignments in that class. And this is in response to traditional assignments where the prompts are set up in a way that the expectation results in similar outcomes, and there's not a lot of variety. One of the things you could think about is all the students that would be doing an observation drawing of the same still life subject matter. All of them are going to end up being pretty similar and focus on this very specific skill without a lot of variety, or maybe students analyzing symbolism in the same exact passage of literature. They're all going to result in something fairly similar without a lot of variety. So instead, flex prompts will focus on abstract, open-ended briefs where the tools, skills, or the concepts are all being explored in a variety of contexts so that students can transfer those and apply them in many different outcomes. And the primary intent of this is to help students find the value individually so that they can apply the material in a way that is meaningful to them. And in that class, I ask my students kind of tongue-in-cheek, when in your education have you had a moment that you've asked, when am I ever going to use this? And many of us have had that experience, and I tell them my goal is that when they ask that question, they not only have an answer, but they have something that demonstrates its utility as well. So in those flexible prompts, for brevity's sake, I'll summarize that brief. But an example of this is in response to a week's content that focuses on different types of visualization, specifically sketching, like diagrams, illustrations, wireframes. And rather than asking my students to all practice the same exact thing, I'm asking them to find a way that would be useful in their own major studies. So I'm asking them, how could the sketching help you in your major field or career? So it's very different than asking the same outcome. They have the flexibility to find how could they apply this in their own area. And another example is a week that focuses on reflective visualization, things like sketchnoting and brainstorming and mind mapping. And instead of everyone doing the same subject matter, I asked them the same type of open-ended flexible prompt. How could visualizing help you find meaning and clarify your own ideas so that they can transfer those specific things into their own area?
The second strategy is focused on student agency. And our aim with this strategy is to have students discover and define what tools, skills, concepts need to be used in their specific instance. And so again, what we're trying to do is fold in that student participation in the crafting of the assignment itself. And so with student agency, and the example that we're giving here, it was a 5-week team-based project in which students were asked to identify a specific problem that they found on campus. From there, they went on to validate what that problem is and work through to a solution for that specific problem. And so in this situation, they had that core learning that happened in the classroom, and now they're being set on their own to be able to solve a problem. The role of the instructor then just becomes sort of in the background to sort of encourage, support, provide that sort of secondary answering of the questions that they're asking, but they're in charge of moving the project forward. And the third strategy, we're calling value-based decision making. What we're trying to do with this strategy is allow students to have, again, the same sense of student leadership within the assignments, but this also starts to focus towards how we assess the assignments. And the distinction that we're trying to make here is that the assessment for them is goal-oriented rather than solution-oriented. The goal is what more closely aligns with what our teaching perspective is, our teaching aim, our teaching objectives are. And so we're trying to have a more direct connection to that without the intermediate steps of the specificity of a specific solution. Again, this starts to address what Zach was talking about with preventing all assignments to look the same, especially the role of a minor isn't to teach a sort of like mastery of skill. Rather, it's to be able to give them this opportunity to express and explore these ideas in service of their unique major. So in this example, it is a 15-week project that's broken into these sort of weekly smaller tasks that they're given flexibility to be able to explore how those skills have meaning within their own project, within their own perspective, within their own interest. And we're encouraging them to fold in their knowledge of their field of study. So that way their project can have ownership and they can start to see the tangible relationship between the skills in design and how that applies to them in their own major. There's a lot of theory to support this, which is really exciting when we're starting to talk about these transferable skills, both transferring sort of the design skills into their major, but also them being able to apply what they're learning in their major into the design classroom. One of the papers is Learner-Led Approaches in Higher Education. And what this really starts to focus us on is how we can connect the dots. A lot of these things do point towards a student wanting to be interested, motivated. These strategies are all learner-led. They're all focused on those learning principles and really being able to think about how can we bring them into the classroom versus just sort of this presentation of information. And so what we're trying to do is have that sense of vision. What's the aim, what's the application in their future, as opposed to it sort of just being sort of like a feature, a generic one that they're all trying to sort of have that same cookie cutter approach to. And so there's a lot of support within this article, and we found it very informative in how we started to craft these strategies. Specifically, here are some examples of how we started to implement this paper into these three specific strategies, both in reiterating the flexible prompts, the student agency, and in value-based decision-making.
And another resource that was a really positive influence was Understanding by Design by Wiggins and McTighe. And some really important ideas that came from this is, most importantly, the difference between knowledge and understanding, and how understanding is more abstract, this kind of big understanding about what's transferable between different areas, knowledge being very contextual and specific, like specific skills or facts. Assessment was also advised in this by asking these big questions of what do we need for our goals? What specific things are we going to look at and examine in the outcomes? And does this proposed evidence enable us to infer student knowledge, skills, or understanding, and hopefully shifting those towards understanding? And the last thing is different facets of understanding, one of them being the application facet of understanding, and that covers how to use knowledge and skill effectively through that transfer, and more importantly, in these realistic scenarios so that there's utility that's there.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things is thinking about knowledge as just sort of the memorization or the acquisition of the information versus their idea of understanding, where it is at sort of their own or self-driven application of that knowledge, and so it becomes that sort of idea of transferable skill. They're applying it to their own aim.
And we can see that at work in these three strategies. Again, the flexible prompts really focusing on application in these realistic scenarios, and it also prioritizes that transferable, since there's this variety in outcomes. They're all transferring those knowledge and skills and strategies into their own area. Student agency focuses on the application as they find real world problems, and value-based incorporating that sense of value-based assessment. It's not necessarily about this knowledge and these rule-based, but instead this value-based understanding focus. What's the big picture and what do we want students to take away from it versus did they follow these very specific rules that maybe are contextualized in that silo? So we'll look at a couple examples, the results of this. And in the flexible prompts in that first week where I ask students to find different examples of sketches and how they could be applicable, I'm asking them to both write and reflect how they think this would be useful in their field, and then show me, create an example of how they might use this on a daily basis in different tasks and experiences they might have. And we can see this really wide variety of outcomes that really show that transferable understanding. I'm not concerned here about the student's mastery of drawing or their control of shape and line or any type of medium, but instead looking at have they used these different types of sketches to see how they are related to what they might use. One of my students is in mechanical engineering and found that blueprint sketches would be really useful and actually created one. Another student did an anatomical diagram of a heart because they're in nursing. So the outcomes have a lot of variety, but they showcase that sketching knowledge that is contextualized can be transferred to their area. And then the other flexible prompt, I'm asking students to identify some process or experience in their field or profession and visualize what that looks like as it makes sense to them. So it's very internal and self-facing so that they can understand what goes on in this process that they may not have noticed before and use different strategies of shape, color, and sketch noting to really visualize what it feels like and as they would remember it. And again, a big variety of outcomes. We can see how they're using visualization transferred into their area, like fashion and retail studies, marketing, information science, so that they can clarify and find these different organizational qualities that they may not have before, and they can find immediate utility in this skill and this specific knowledge transferred into their area of major study, so that hopefully that is advancing their understanding of it.
Yeah, we also saw that in the second strategy of student agency in that 5-week team activity project. One of the main components of that was the students being able to find their topic. Once they sort of identified their topic, they're often running and applying specific skills and tools and finding their own strategies for solving that. But what I think is particularly remarkable is the range of topics that the students addressed. And this is, of course, over several semesters of students being able to sort of self-select, self-identify what is a problem that they want to address. But through this process, students that gravitated towards a team and formed a team and moved through this really were motivated. They found problems that were meaningful to them, things that were of interest to them. And I think what's particularly fantastic about this is that these are prompts, these are topics, problems that I would not have identified as their instructor. All the way down the list to, if it's not you, it's just your professor's personality, where the students were stressing their frustration and not being able to maybe read who their professor is, and wanting to find that sort of alignment of their teaching style with the student's learning style. And so how could that classroom or class selection play out on a scale of Ohio State? And so there's all of these different opportunities, all these different investigations that are student-led in the process. Not just in their identification, but then through completion. They are given 5 weeks of complete sort of hands-off opportunity for them to work through these problems on their own and identify both sort of those roles. How can I as a marketing major contribute? How can I as a engineering major contribute? and find that contribution and those opportunities for them to add value within their project. We saw this similarly in this fourth example, the one where it's this 15-week project that sort of builds. It's a scaffolded course. But this value-based decision-making really gave us a perspective, and it opened up this opportunity. When student work does not look the same, the burden falls on the instructor to be able to assess it, especially when it comes down to grading and things like that. And so the ability to be able to articulate goal-specific items in the rubric allowed us to identify how a much easier, more simplified and streamlined way of both communicating the rubric to students, but also to the graders on our team. Instead of solution-specific rubrics, which might focus on some of the output, use of color, typography, grids, and orientation, we're looking at what was the student trying to do? What was their aim? What was their goal? And did they use their knowledge of typography to support that emotion that they're trying to communicate, the visceral reaction that they're trying to elicit? It became much easier to coordinate and to be able to identify and describe that both for the student perspective so they know what we were asking them to do, but then also for the grading team and being able to ascribe a grade to the students that was consistent throughout the class, despite the variety of how the work appeared. And so in this implementation, one of the things that we're driving towards and that we're trying to encourage both in this presentation and what will be a part of our paper is this idea of how can we motivate students to be active participants, not just in the classroom, in discussions and things like that. That's sort of the expected. But how can they be an active participant in the assignments themselves so that way they can lean into it? And so to do that, some of the things that we're encouraging is a consideration for your discipline. What's knowledge versus understanding? I think being able to identify that really helped us start to have a new perspective towards how we could reimagine this program. Also being able to identify those most important transferable skills, or the transferable skills are most important when they're in a minor capacity, as opposed to the students that are in our major. And then having those opportunities for student agency, investigating how they want to learn this, why they're taking that major and how that can sort of fold back into their major work, how that can be in service of this. And so there can be this sort of scaffolding, this blending between their major and minor coursework instead of it sort of being this standalone, isolated thing. And I think this last point is also really important. As the types of projects grow, we need to be able to assess it fairly and justly. And so being able to have this idea of value-based decision-making, of being able to sort of fold this into goal-oriented grading, allows us to provide this flexibility, to have students imagine what else it could be instead of just being a poster, how else they could express their ideas so that way they can be a leader in their learning experience.
So in our summary, those are our 3 strategies that we use to bridge that gap between the major and minor studies. That first one is flexible prompts, and how can we have open-ended briefs that allow the student expertise to come into it, promoting and allowing room for student agency so that their interests and their motivation can come into it, and we shift from obligation to motivation. And lastly, value-based decision-making. How can we make our rubrics and our assessment be goal-specific rather than that solution-specific? And all of those are in service to how can we get the major and the minor coursework to interweave together so that they're not individual silos, they're not just forced into one another, but they inform and harmonize with each other. So we thank you for your time for joining us. Please feel free to contact either one of us, share your perspectives or questions. Thank you.
Thank you.